Welcome everyone. Today's webinar, Understanding Hate Crimes. I'm very excited to have Stephen Camp with us, as well as Dr. Christopher Wells. I want to start with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the land in which we gather in Treaty 6 territory is the traditional gathering place for many Indigenous people. We honor and respect the history, languages, ceremonies, and culture of the First Nation, Métis, and Inuit who call this territory home. The First People's connection to the land teaches us about our inherent responsibility to protect and respect Mother Earth. With this acknowledgement, we honor the ancestors and children who have been buried here, missing and murdered Indigenous women and men, and the process of ongoing collective healing for all human beings. We're reminded that we're all treaty people and of the responsibility we have to one another. So I'm very excited to have Stephen Camp with us today. Steve is a hate crimes expert and retired member of the Edmonton Police Service, where he worked for 30 years. Over his distinguished career, Steve managed the criminal investigative section, homicide, and internet child exploitation, and co-founded the EPS Hate Crimes Unit, where he investigated hate crimes, hate propaganda offenses, and infiltrated and dismantled white supremacist neo-Nazi organizations as an undercover operator and investigations manager. Currently, Steve is completing a graduate program in justice studies focused on hate crimes at Royal Roads University. And we also have Dr. Christopher Wells, an associate professor in the Faculty of Health and Community Studies, and holds the Canada Research Chair for Public Understanding of Sexual and Gender Minority Youth at MacEwan University here. Previously, he served as the inaugural chair of the St. Albert Policing Committee in partnership with the RCMP, and was a co-chair of the Chiefs Community Advisory Committee with the Edmonton Police Service. So before we get started here, I'll just go over a few quick housekeeping items. The mics and cameras will remain off for the duration of the presentation. Feel free to use the chat and Q&A for questions and comments. We'll have time at the end for some Q&A. And another FYI, I've mentioned it a few times, but this session is being recorded and it'll be sent out after, likely early next week, Monday or Tuesday. So keep an eye out for that in your email. So with that, I'll pass it over to Steve, and I hope you enjoy the webinar.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending the Lunch and Learn today. Basically, we're going to be talking about an excellent module that we put together under the leadership of Dr. Chris Wells. But first, I have to make an acknowledgement as a white heterosexual cis male and ex-police officer working within this domain of hate crimes and extremism. I'm fully aware and acknowledge my presence can be a colonial, oppressive representation to vulnerable communities. However, I hope you see me as a committed ally who is humbled to work alongside you, thus will remain vigilant in progressing towards a victim-centric lens due to the historical injustices of my race, gender, and occupation. I think that's important to acknowledge that, which brings me to think about the time that Dr. Chris Wells and I first met when I was a young constable with the Edmonton Police Service, and I had just received the funding to research and develop the Edmonton Police Service's Hate Crimes Unit. One of the things that we were doing was engaging the communities in Edmonton about what we're about and what we can do, and how we can build a community engagement, kind of a formal process. And I was lucky enough to have some really great leadership within the LGBTQ2S+ community that I was reaching out to, and we all met at a Heritage Room in City Hall one cold winter day, and I saw this young man way in the back seat there. Well, I was young back then too, by the way, sitting skeptically, and rightfully so. The historical trauma and harm that police services across North America has done on the queer community is unprecedented and is historically documented. Specifically as well here in Edmonton. And as we went through our presentation and showed the authenticity and sincerity of what we were trying to do and build, Chris came along on side, and that started a 23-year kind of work that we had done over those 2 decades on a number of fronts, dealing specifically with my area of expertise, hate crime, but at times specifically with Chris's area of expertise within the community. So we did a number of projects together, and one of the things that was always frustrating us was it was interesting to see how the community the society is confused about hate crime, and rightfully so. It's a mishmash of patchwork legislation and case law, and we're going to see, and this you're going to see some of it here in the presentation today. But we always felt it was necessary for a public-facing educational module for the communities to understand exactly what hate crime is all about, and that's what we're going to go through today. We're going to talk about the importance of the module, what it and some of the things that are in it. Give you a little bit of education as well. So the topics we are going to cover today is, why is this module important? And we're going to talk about the threat of extremism and its manifestation, hate crime, which is probably most of you are aware in the audience today, is really increasing in its proliferation exponentially across North America. The educational component is going to be about, we're going to give you a little bit about what hate crime is, its definitions, the limited legislation that's available. That'll probably spur more conversation and hopefully a thirst for knowledge, and some of the questions can be answered within the module itself. The essence of why hate crime is so unique is important, which is the impacts and trauma onto society and communities. A little bit on barriers to reporting, and then provide the course registration link to you as well. So we hope that this presentation offers a kind of a glimpse into what this module can do, and the subsequent modules that we're looking at developing as we move forward here on this endeavor. It's good to note that as we're trying to educate people on hate crimes, it's important to provide that nexus between hate crimes and its motivation. Hate, so criminality and hate have to combine and clash together, and that nexus has to be done. In order to do that, we do show and talk about certain statements and symbols, and we won't do any recordings today, a video or audio at all, as far as examples, but there is examples of hate crimes and hate incident. We feel it's important for people to recognize that nexus point through visual representation. So in those discussions and in those representations, it may be challenging emotionally for a number of you. It may be disturbing, and if you wish, it may be traumatizing. If you need to step away from this webinar, please do. Yeah, so just be aware of that. So from here on in, there will be some stuff, including this next slide, which we're going to get right into, which is an introduction about why hate crime education is so important. And this actually picture was from a Mischief to residents here in Edmonton. Most of the stuff that we're going to show you is either Alberta or Edmonton based as well. But the question always is, why is hate crime education important? And I kind of alluded to at the beginning of this presentation, saying that it's a confluence of mismatched legislation and definitions across North America. And I'm going to be specific to Canada. It is one of the most complex crime types in the criminal code, specifically because, and I really focus on this a lot. I focus on this with a paper I put out there to the federal government to get a standalone hate crime legislation enacted inside the criminal code. But because there's no hate crime section, there's no legislation to guide academics, NGOs, civil society organizations, community members, institutions that are charged with managing and enforcing hate crimes across Canada are confused. And if the police who are supposed to attend these things are confused, there's definitely a confusion within the public. So with legislation and enforcement comes case law, and case law is like the bread and butter that guides agencies and institutions through the criminal justice system and how to manage hate crime through their enforcement capabilities. And without it, we can't do it. So what you have is, you have a lot of police agencies and frontline personnel in the constable and detective rank that are investigators that have a difficult time trying to understand what hate crime. If you think about the various definitions across the country, there are 177 police agencies in Canada. Each one is basically given the autonomy to develop their own hate crime definition for their members, and that would include hate crime data collection techniques, if they even have any. So because of that, it's quite convoluted. So if you when you dive as a novice into this area, it's almost overwhelmingly confusing to the average person, and then the police don't get it either. So we think it's important for the country, for the society to understand what hate crime is. They should know that police agencies have responsibilities, that government has responsibilities to handle this type of crime, including consistencies and standards. There's a lot of confusion as well in regards to the difference between hate propaganda, which we'll go into a little bit, the hate propaganda sections versus offensive speech. And the narrative in the public sphere is confusing to people. Not everything is a crime, that's speech, and not everything is a hate crime. And so the modules kind of go into that. It explains and clarifies some things for you so that the public and the institutions and the police and academia at least can start moving toward being on the same page. This is important too. There's limited hate crime specialism in the country when it comes to, and I'm going to be specific to police here, less than half the police services in the country have any kind of hate crime specialism within their organizations. So you'll have smaller enforcement agencies or police agencies that have no ability to understand and investigate hate crime or data collect or anything like that. And then if you go to the government institutions, both at all three levels, depending on the region, they could be limited understanding and initiatives or policies based on this. So, and building on that is the stuff we just talked about: no legislation, no case law, no definition. So it just adds to the confusion. People don't need to know why hate crimes happen as well. There's multiple theories over there as to why hate crimes happen. It's good to know. That drives policy. If hate crimes are happening for specific reasons, then is there things that we can do within our society to counter that? I think that's really important. So, and it's something else the modules go into. Knowledge is power, right? And data collection is power. So when people understand what hate crimes is and what to do to facilitate good reporting, it leads to better reporting and better intake, which leads to better trust building and ultimately facilitates better policy decisions. And policy decisions, especially with police reported hate crime, drives resources and policy at all three levels of government. And I think that's important. And it's, I guess, one of the issues we'll talk about as well, that limited trust to police organizations from affected communities is important. And so, having education for these vulnerable communities that are victims of hate crime is important. So at least they know what the powers are that the police have and where they are deficient in their approach to hate crime. Understanding across all these levels, both laterally and horizontally, does reduce tensions in society as well. Like I said, it puts us on the same page, and this module is the first step in that direction. It's important to understand the threat to hate crime in Canada, extremism. Hate crime is in the extremism continuum. It's inside the extremism landscape, just below the national security requirements. So it's which I won't get into today, but the government of Canada and academia and intelligence agencies are looking at extremism currently as one of the most serious threats facing Canada today. So we feel it's important for the public and society to understand the complications, the complexities of hate crime. If you look at the 2019 study from Barbara Perry, they identified 82 to 101 extremist groups operating within Canada. What's interesting here is we're not talking about the lone wolves or the lone individuals that are, I guess, consuming this ideology of hate, that they're influenced by this. So, the extremist groups are 82 to 100, which may seem like a lot, but it's the lone wolves, for example, that we're always concerned about, that are not operating within an extremist group environment. And so the extremist groups are pumping out an ideology that people are consuming and then incorporating inside their jurisdiction. So police of jurisdiction, if they don't understand what hate crime is, if the community doesn't understand what hate crime is, it's hard to decipher who's doing what, and is there intervention policies or strategies that we can use to move people away from these extremist ideologies and away from violent activity, for example. If you look at the amount of murders that are extremist related in Canada between 2014 and 22, there's 28, a high amount. You look at the 72% increase in hate crimes between 19 and 21, and then the 7% increase that just came out in the last crime report by Stats Canada in 2022. The threat in Canada is high, and I think the educational component for everyone, not just the police and intelligence agencies, are important to be aware of. And if you look at, I kind of focused on a few times on police reported hate crime versus hate crime. We'll talk about barriers in a few minutes, but there is barriers to reporting, and most of it comes down to trust with policing. In the 2019 General Social Survey that was facilitated by Stats Canada, 233,000 hate events were tabulated, and that versus the 1,946 hate crimes that were collected by, this is police reported hate crimes by Stats Canada as well. So that difference is gobsmacking. Now, the only thing to be aware of, the caveat is that of the 233,000, there was no verification if a hate crime actually occurred. These were just respondents. So there was no investigative process. But even if you say to yourself, look, out of the 233,000, if 10% were authentic hate crimes or hate incidents, that's 23,000 versus 1,946, which is still gobsmacking. So there is definitely a barrier to the reporting issue. And I think that the educational component for the society is really important. It may increase reporting. So hate crime. One thing I want to say before I give you the definition, I kind of alluded to this. There is no hate crime section in the criminal code that's a standalone section. There's hate-related offenses that we'll talk about, but there's no hate crime section, which leaves all organizations, all institutions in society, in Canadian society, with to devise their own hate crime definition. So keep that in mind. So if I give you when I give you this hate crime definition, this is one that I built for the Edmonton Police Service back in the day when Chris and I were working on stuff together. And then it's also the Alberta Hate Crimes Committee definition, but it doesn't mean it's the Calgary definition or Red Deer RCMP or Medicine Hat or Camrose or Halifax or Victoria. Each one unilaterally can devise their own hate crime definition. There is a lot of work being done at the national level to ensure that definitions remain, certain principles of the definitions remain consistent and standardized, but it's not mandated. So basically, I could operate a small police agency somewhere in Alberta and just devise my own hate crime definition that may be different from Edmonton's or Calgary's. But there's a couple of things, and I talked about the Nexus. The most important thing to remember, and again, this is the educational point I'm going to tell you about here. There has to be a criminal offense that occurs, and the Nexus has to be the hate motivation to be a hate crime. Those two things, that if all the stuff you see there, take away that. So there has to be a criminal offense committed against a person or property, which is motivated, which is key, in whole or in part, by the suspect's hate, bias, or prejudice towards an identifiable group based on real or perceived. Real or perceived means, and I'll give you the example to explain, if I commit a crime on let's say a male that I believe to be gay, but he's not, it would be considered still a hate crime. If the male was heterosexual, cis, it would still be considered a hate crime because the motivation is what drives the classification. In whole or in part basically means that there could be multiple motivations for a crime. If one of them is hate, it's still considered a hate crime. That's why we put those in. It makes it more wholesome. It makes it more fulsome. The identified groups, ethnic origin, language, color, etc., comes from a section in the criminal code under hate propaganda section, section 318.4. And I think it's really important, if it's going to be a criminal offense where police would be involved, that we link into the criminal justice system through existing legislation and the hate propaganda laws. And that's why we mirror the identified groups here. And most organizations incorporate all these identified groups within their definition. So some examples here. Some of you may remember this, the anti-Muslim hate crime that occurred this summer, where this accused caused a mischief to property by pouring a drink liquid onto the Quran. There was, images like this were taken around the Edmonton area. I threw this one in here on the, this is to show the complexity of hate crime as well. And I won't get into it just for the sake of time, but some would consider this a protest and not a hate crime. Others would consider a hate crime against Catholic community. So geopolitical, historical oppression can really affect the complexity of a crime that occurs. And hate crime investigators have to sift through that, sometimes geopolitical, historical issues to confirm the classification of particular types of crime. This was a mischief to the crosswalk, the Pride crosswalk that occurred. And then this is interesting, if you understand intersectionality, these are hate crimes that were committed against Black, female, Somalian woman, Muslim as well. So 4 points of identities here on some just one person, all assaults onto members of all 4 communities in the Edmonton region and Edmonton itself. I threw this one in. This was a recent one. It was an attack by a person that was anti-gender identity, gender expression, that occurred in Waterloo. A lot of people, because of the mass casualty event, there was 4, I think, that went down in the stabbings. 4 individuals were hurt, none were killed. But it was a hate motivated mass casualty crime is basically how I classify this. It did fall under the national security requirements, so it would be considered a hate crime with multiple victims against an identified community as well. That was our accused there. So hate incidents are interesting. Incidents are important to report because the police do want to know the potential conflict and public safety points within a society. So hate incident, like I said, I did kind of mention the extremism continuum. So in the field of extremism, persons can commit hate incidents and then go and commit a hate crime, and then maybe go into the national security realm and commit terrorism event. So that's important to know. So people that are influenced by hate ideologies or have these influences in their life are going to be anywhere on the spectrum at any time. So temporally speaking, we don't know what they're going to do next. Police do want to know about hate incidents that occur in your environment. So basically, we do advocate, most police services do advocate that hate incidents be reported. Basically, it's exactly the same as a hate crime, but it's a non-criminal event, and every other part of the definition is the same. However, I just want to highlight that these incidents are very important to the police in regards to ensuring public safety, so they can identify past criminal offenses that were hate motivated or future ones, or identify people that are really committed to a radicalized version of whatever extremist ideology they want to hold on to, like white supremacy, neo-Nazism, Christian identity, whatever it may be. Here's some examples of hate incidents as well. None of them are a criminal offense. The sticker from the particular construction company, the flag, these are all Alberta and Edmonton based as well. Tattoos that you might see in public. The last one right here is infamous guy named Kyle McKee, who was a hate crime, a neo-Nazi white supremacist. And his rhetoric on a TV interview wouldn't be considered a hate crime, but it was offensive when he talks about securing the white race and doing what they can to make sure that happens, if that includes violence. So things like that can happen. They're very important for police. If you look at all four of these, this would be if I'm running a hate crime unit, all four files are of interest to me. That may not, some of the files that we get that are hate incidents may not move into any kind of realm, criminal realm, but it's probably better to know if the agency responsible for public safety. So make sure that, I always say this, I always advocate, report to police on hate incidents. And these are some examples of hate incidents as well that have occurred in Alberta or across Canada that may be of interest to police agencies. Really quickly on the legislation, this one could be a full day, so I'm going to do it all in about a minute here. The reason I split them up here, I get the first three sections, 318, 319, and 320 there for a specific reason. Those are the hate propaganda sections. People call them hate speech. I call them, it's not hate speech, it's hate propaganda. There's a legal difference. And the threshold to conduct an investigative process and get the sign off by the Attorney General for the move ahead with prosecution is very high. The threshold is enormous. I've done them. People around me that I work with have done them, and we've been successful on them, but it's definitely not hate speech. It's hate propaganda. And the case law for all three sections is ripe and old, especially section 319 sub 2. The other section in the criminal code that I really like is the bottom one. This is an excellent piece of legislation that was brought in about 1994, 1995 by Justice Minister Alan Rock. That's 718.2 sub A sub 1 is a sentencing principle. It's not a charge section. However, it definitely is very good for the principle for the sentencing. So after the trial, if the person was convicted of a crime and the prosecutor feels it's hate motivated, they can move into a sentencing hearing on a 718 and invoke a greater sentence for the individual that committed the crime. The only section that's a hate crime that's outside the realm of sentencing and hate propaganda is a post 9/11 section that came in that used to be mischief to religious property, but now encompasses property used by identified communities. It's one section that deals with hate motivation. I'm a big advocate of the standalone section, and I think we need a standalone one that covers all. So I'm going to show you this really quickly just for the sake of time. The fourth bubble at the bottom, it basically stipulates evidence that the offense was motivated by bias, prejudice, or hate based on race. And there's that list there that we mirror off of. That list is also in 318 sub 4, and that mirrors our definitions. But basically, if the evidence shows that it was hate against an identified community, then we would the prosecution could get a better increased sentencing for the person that committed the hate crime. always like this quote by a Holocaust survivor, and he's right on the money on this one. Like the perpetrators of hate propaganda, usually it's kind of interesting. They're not the ones that usually commit the hate crimes; it's the followers, right? So the people who propagate, for example, in a hate organization or neo-Nazi group, would be propagating stuff like this. It's the followers that really buy into the ideology or heavily influenced that you'll see committing acts of hate, and they might even move into the national security realm with terrorist events that happen. If you look at Manassian or Alexander Borsonat, who committed murders for the sake of extremism, they're moving into national security territory there with why they did it. And again, that's a whole workshop in itself about how you move into the national security or the NS field. But the point is that sometimes, as one Supreme Court judge says, people will believe just about anything, right? So hence the hate propaganda laws. It's very important for society to function, for freedom, and for democracy. Hate propaganda does limit people's freedoms because propaganda can be absorbed and believed and commit people to action in all sorts of various ways, such as discrimination through housing, employment, et cetera, et cetera. So these hate propaganda sections exist. The case law is strong, and it's an excellent addition to the criminal code. So a quick look at the sections here for the sake of time. It's already 12:30. I got about 10 minutes left, maybe 5. So that's the promotes genocide one. Basically, the key ones here: advocates or promotes genocide with intent to destroy, right, any identifiable group, which is listed in 318 sub 4, by killing members of the group or deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction. 319 sub 1 is public incitement, basically making statements in public that incites hate towards an identified group that it's likely to lead to like a criminal breach, right, or a breach of the peace. Someone's inflaming the people are around them, and it's going to be like, we're going to smash windows in the Jewish community, for example, like that. This one has been 319 sub 2, willful promotion of hatred. This one is prosecuted fairly regularly in Canada. There's lots of case law on this. Key segments are communicating statements, right, other than in private conversation, which is heavily case law. And the words willfully promotes hate are really delineated in the case law as well. So basically, anybody who willfully promotes hatred in public against an identified group, there's potential charge. The toll is extremely high. The case law is very interesting. If I'm a kind of a Supreme Court of Canada case law weenie, I'd like to look at hate crime case law. Kigstra, if anybody wants to look at that one, is an excellent read. It's about a 30 to 45-minute read, 45-minute for me. It's very interesting, but why I kind of point to Kigstra under Judge Dixon is because that Kigstra decision is the anchor for subsequent decisions up till now. Will continue to use the words used by Judge Dixon in their Supreme Court decision and their case law, that they heavily rely on that decision. It's an excellent decision. So the Kigstra decision is excellent. The new one that came out under hate propaganda laws is basically Holocaust denial laws. It's written, it was just in the last year or two that just came into effect. This here is why hate crimes, besides the complexity of it and the legislative framework complexity and the social policy complexity and the definitional complexity, is what makes hate, this one here makes hate crimes essential for heavy attention by all agencies involved in the world of hate crime, because this is at the heart of our democracy. It attacks the intrinsic fundamental essence of an individual's identity. And the identifiable characteristic is a typically immutable permanent feature of the victim and the victim's community. And this is a huge effect onto our society. Not only is the direct target of the hate crime, and again, there's so much research on this, which I'll go in, I can't go into due to sake of time, but the impacts are enormous. Dozens and dozens of reports and emotional and psychological effects are listed through academic peer-reviewed articles that show over and over the types of impacts that they have. But what's interesting is the individual impacts are similar to the community impacts. And these are the people that are affiliated with the individual that are targeted directly. They weren't targeted directly, but they know about it, but they feel the same effects because they know that they could be next. They know that there's going to be fear and anxiety, and there's going to be increased security concerns. They feel all the same things. And this is why it's so damaging to society. It actually divides groups and divides groups from institutions charged with protecting them from hate crimes. And if there's a lack of understanding, I'm going to go back to what the modules are for, if there's a lack of understanding, it increases that trust gap even more. And that's one of the reasons Chris, who led this initiative for MacEwan University, to have a forward-facing module for the public. And the final thing I'm going to talk about quickly, there's, because of all the trust issues and the colonial oppressive nature of policing and all the variables that come into play there, there's a number of barriers to reporting, which the module goes into as well. Some of them I'll kind of throw up here for the sake of time of the cookie, but I won't get into it. But I will say one thing, it's challenging. Police are challenged to get people coming in to report hate crimes because of the distrust to police. And that alone, the research showing that if you believe in praxis and moving theory to practice, this would be one of the first things I would do. What do we do to increase trust to police? It's a policy piece, I think, that'll move individuals, government, and their staffers into maybe devising legislative frameworks or policy that kind of assists society in combating hate.
So I personally want to thank you all for joining us. We had a great response to this webinar. I want to thank the School of Continuing Education and MacEwan University for supporting this important work, and a big thank you to Steve for his lifelong work, passion, in this area. And that's certainly how I became involved with Steve. I remember that first meeting that we had in the community, and I sat there with my arms literally crossed, saying, what do the police have to tell our community? And it was the passion and the purpose that won me over, and knew that we had to work collectively on this issue. The answers were not going to just simply be found within the police or within the government or within the community, but of all of us coming together collectively to address a very important and pressing social issue. So thank you all. Sean, I'll turn it over to you for the last words.
Yeah, thank you, Chris and Steve. I'll just end by saying how much I admire you for the work that you're doing and how important it is. I know that the School of Continuing Education is very proud to be supporting this project, and personally seeing how important these discussions are, basically as we see the fragility of democracy itself sort of become more evident with the things that are happening south of the border as well as here. This is very timely, and thank you both for the work that you're doing. If you want to learn more about it, the link is up on the screen here, macewan.ca/hate crimes. Feel free to email us at macewan@sce.com if you have any questions. The first module is starting September 1st, and we have scheduled monthly. So September 1st, October 1st, November 1st, December 1st will be the first 4 offerings of that, and hopefully we'll have many more to come.